Elizabeth.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Great Decisions lecture series. We are on lecture 3 of 6 of this year's series. Today, we are discussing how will U.S. foreign policy engage Russia during the Biden administration. Russia and the United States have many areas of conflict and some possible areas of mutual interest. Arms control, Russian interference in US elections and support of cyber attacks, the status of Ukraine, the fate of opposition politicians in Russia, all continue to be concerning. How will the new administration in Washington approach these issues? Our speaker today joins us from Bowling Green State University. Dr. Stefan Fritsch is an associate professor of political science. His research focuses on issues of international relations, international political economy, and comparative politics. He is particularly interested in the relationship between technology and international affairs, the political economy of technological innovation, global trade issues, globalization, theories of international political economy, multinational corporations, and European integration. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Fritsch. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me. This is very exciting. This is also my first time, so to speak, to do this this kind of lecture for the Citizen Center here online. I'm gonna try and share my screen, hoping that we get to. There we go. Okay. Let me turn this. Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. I have several goals in my own presentation, and then of course I would be really extremely happy to take questions from you as regarding the topic, questions you might have. My presentation is going to focus a little bit more on sort of the Russian side to make us understand sort of what's happening with Russia and sort of what the Russian goals are here currently. And I hope that then in the discussion we can sort of switch a little more in towards sort of this question of, okay, what are we going to do? What are we supposed to do? What are the options here to engage with Russia in the topic areas that Liz mentioned in her intro. So I hope that everybody can see the presentation. If not, please let me know. So I called this presentation Putin's Russia between political authoritarianism, great power ambitions, and domestic failures. And the goals here, sort of a heads up of how I will present this, are we'll basically look a little bit at the domestic transformation of Russia. So we will look a little bit at just what has been going on in Russia basically since the early 1990s. Again, this is a very brief overview. I don't want to overburden people, and obviously this would be a lot to cover. So I had to cherry pick a little bit to sort of drive my points home here. And I'm going to break it down into the economic and the political sphere. And then in the second step, I will briefly look at Russia in the world. So what has happened basically with Russia as a global player. Again, breaking it down between the Yeltsin era and then Russia's resurgence or efforts to work towards a resurgence under Putin. And then I will end with a brief outlook in terms of what are the goals of Russia here, sort of big picture approach. Okay, so the Yeltsin era lasted basically from 1991 till 1999. That's when he was president. That's, of course, the immediate post-communist era. That's Russia after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, which was accompanied by, economically speaking, by a steep and very broad decline that was, driven by a massive deindustrialization. As it turned out, a lot of the state-owned companies and whole industrial sectors were basically not competitive. They had been artificially propped up during the 1980s. So it was this deindustrialization, the liberalization that went along with that. So liberalization means you basically introduce the free market principle into the economy. And as a consequence of that, it turned out that a lot of these industries were not competitive. And the last part of this was then privatization. That means that the economic system basically switched from public state-owned property to privately owned property, and that was a very messy process during which a lot of economic assets, fell into the hands of people who were already well connected and profited from this murky privatization process. There were some of those people, of course, made a fortune with that and later became what we know as oligarchs. But for the broad mass of people, this whole period was basically characterized by a dramatic drop in living standards, salaries, living standards, public services. All of that basically did not improve, to the contrary. As a consequence of this massive decline and then consequently the budgetary problems that the Russian government faced, they needed loans from abroad. So Russia turned to the West, so to speak, and had to ask for loans. Those loans were provided by Western multilateral institutions, international organizations like the IMF or the World Bank, which were, of course, dominated by Western countries. So with those loans that were granted, the West obviously gained considerable leverage over Russia, and could to some extent, of course, dictate the terms of those liberalization and privatization processes. But it also provided the West with leverage in the political sense that Russia wasn't able to sort of insert itself into a range of developments that were happening post-Cold War, so to speak. In political terms, on the domestic level, the country did switch under Yeltsin to a more democratic system. We had a multi-party system. We had rather competitive elections. The media enjoyed a relative level of freedom. Non-governmental, non-profit organizations, citizens were able to, freely express themselves for the first time. So, in many ways, it was a freer Russia. Also, sort of administratively, Russia became more decentralized. So the regions actually gained quite some independence, so to speak. So more things could be decided at the regional and local level. As a whole, though, the system remained fragile, right? This is something that is can often be observed in countries that go through massive political transitions, particularly from authoritarian to more democratic systems. The democracy in those early years is often very fragile. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, I'm going to show you just some brief graphs here, tables to illustrate these massive changes. So here we have basically GDP, the GDP development in Russia between 1988 and sort of the early 2020s, and you can see sort of this dramatic decline in GDP, especially for the first 10, 15 years. So this is obviously the late Soviet era, and then transitioning into the post-Soviet era. I'm gonna hold off on the developments after 2000, right? Because there you see increase, so it starts rising. And the other thing you see is sort of this fluctuation of GDP, and I'm gonna get to the reasons for that in a little bit, okay? But just note that initially you see this decline. And now the next one is GDP per capita. So that's per when we break the GDP down on a per capita basis. And I think here you see this decline. It's in a much better actually. So for the individual Russian citizen, these 1990s are really sort of a lost decade because you know, it's just everything got more expensive. The salaries actually shrank, right? Also because of massive inflation. The state cuts down a range of welfare services. The healthcare system crumbled. So here you actually see this decline much better. It's even more visible than if we just looked at the GDP, okay? And again, I'm gonna hold off on the second half, so to speak, of that graph. Okay, so on the global stage, obviously, Russia also experienced a dramatic decline in its influence, right, and its power projection capabilities. The Soviet Union breaks up ultimately in 1991, and what is formed is a relatively weak organization that was named the Commonwealth of Independent States. So that was a way for Russia, you know, trying to extend, so to speak, these special relationships with now newly independent countries. So this is different from, you know, the former satellite countries like Hungary, Poland, Eastern Germany, and so on. There were a range of countries like the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, countries in the Caucasus region here between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, right? Your Georgia, Azerbaijan. So the Central Asian countries. There's a whole range of countries that basically broke away from the Soviet Union and became independent. So in many ways, obviously a traumatizing experience, especially for President Putin, right? He has brought this up repeatedly in the past, that this was a sort of had a deep impact on his outlook on world politics. On top of that, to add, so to speak, injury to insult, or insult to injury, many of these former satellite countries, as well as some newly independent countries, are rapidly sort of pivoting towards the West. Politically, economically, countries start joining NATO, and then eventually also the European Union. This was a long and drawn out process, very complex on both sides, but it ultimately meant that a lot of these former, what Russia calls the near abroad, became sort of firmly established and became a part and integrated into the West. So the West was, so to speak, encroaching slowly on Russia. The other development that was sort of traumatizing for Russia was that it was largely sidelined during a lot of the, you know, major international crisis moments in the 90s and 2000s. It couldn't really insert itself during these times, partly because the West had so much leverage over Russia. So just to bring up a couple briefly, the first Iraq War under the Bush Senior, the second Iraq War under Bush Jr., but also in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So all these conflicts in the Balkans, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, and then later Afghanistan. You know, Russia was never able to really, I would want to say, punch at its weight category, right? So it was really sidelined in many ways. And then in terms of military power, briefly, well, because of all these budgetary problems that we've talked about, it also fell behind in terms of armaments. The military was falling behind, manpower, particularly in terms of technology. They were simply outspent by the US, by NATO, but increasingly also by other countries like China and also India. And then the last point I want to bring up that was also quite traumatizing was that Russia loses the first war in Chechnya. So Chechnya is a mostly Muslim dominated autonomous region that is sort of sitting here on top of Georgia. And they tried to break away, sort of in the wake of all these other countries. They tried to break away from Russia and declare independence, and Russia basically crushed that in the secessionist movement and in a very brutal war. Tried to crush it, I should say, right? But they weren't capable of doing it in that first war in Chechnya between 94 and 96. So we will see that that was sort of the entry point for Putin. Okay. This graph shows you military spending, Russian military spending in constant current US dollars. So you see how basically the 1990s, it goes up and down, but the real increase basically comes after 2000. And that falls together with Vladimir Putin becoming first prime minister and then president, but also with some economic developments, mainly the increasing revenues from oil and gas. But you also see how, it kind of tracks. So roughly military spending falls in line with the overall development of Russia's budget, right, government budget. So as long as oil revenues were increasing, so was the military budget. And then you see sort of this drop off in 2012. Since then, it's been sort of rather, fluctuating. Okay, so now fast forward, what has become known as a sort of renaissance in the Putin era. Several things are important here. First of all, a rather impressive economic recovery in Russia. Mainly because of increasing oil and gas prices. So that's for the 2000s and 2010s, that decade. These revenues were used surprisingly wisely. And Putin, who became president in 2000, before that, he was prime minister, but then Yeltsin died in 1999, and Putin steps in first as interim, but then he gets elected in 2000 in a resounding victory. He uses these revenues to achieve what at that point was the most important thing, and that was to pay off all that foreign debt. So he knew that foreign debt provided a lot of leverage for the West, and so he used the revenues primarily to pay off the debt. Russia is almost debt-free nowadays. The public debt to GDP ratio is around 20%, which is extremely low. Just to give you a comparison, the US right now is more than 100% at this point, right? And Japan is always sort of this drastic outlier with more than 200% public debt to GDP. So he got rid of that thorn in his thigh, so to speak. On top of that, he built up a reserve fund. So it's about 500 billion US dollars in a sort of a rainy day fund that has periodically been replenished to make sure that they have resources available when the economic situation turns really dire. So that's the good news for Russia. The bad news is that because oil and gas and some other raw materials are so central for the Russian economy, it's a wonderful example of what we know in political economy as the resource curse. So because excuse me? Oh, sorry. I thought there was a question. So the resource curse in a nutshell just means that you're over dependent on these few things. And because you have a steady inflow of revenue, there's very little incentive to diversify the economy. There are a lot of other countries around the world, mostly less developed countries in Africa, for example, that have to deal with that. Also, countries on the Arab Peninsula were marked by this, had to deal with this problem for a long time, but they have, in the meantime, started to diversify quite dramatically because they see the writing on the wall that these natural resources will eventually, dry up. So that's a problem, the resource curse, particularly in a situation where you have an authoritarian government, right? Because the government decides how these revenues are used. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that the average citizen profits from those revenues to the same extent as the political elite or the economic elites, for that matter. And moreover, to sort of bring that to an end, this growth model that is based on natural resources seems to have sort of leveled out, right? He can't generate any more economic growth with that. And since the gas prices, are at least not in the foreseeable future skyrocketing, he really has an economic problem down the road. The other problem that he has in that regard are the Western sanctions. So it's very hard for him to diversify the economy simply because Russia doesn't have access to a lot of sophisticated technology, which falls under a lot of economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, especially since the annexation of Crimea and sort of this interference in the Ukraine. So there are some serious problems down the road in economic terms. Okay, now domestically, obviously, Putin has basically conducted a 180-degree flip. Anything that was achieved in terms of political freedoms, decentralization, etc., under Yeltsin has been reversed. The media has been curtailed. I mean, it's basically now all state-run media, at least the big ones, the big TV channels, etc. There is, of course, some independent media, but they have a minuscule market share. The electoral laws have been customized. One can really say customized to serve Putin and his party, United Russia. That means they're almost always guaranteed a majority in the elections. The constitution has been modified to allow Putin to now theoretically stay in power until 2036. This is also possible because so in this constitutional transformation, this new constitution was approved in a public referendum in I have to remember, I think it was 2012, I think, somewhere around 2012, 2013, which also extended the terms for the president. So one term is now 6 years. And so all of this together basically means that he has really cemented his own position as president. Because up to that point, the president can only have 2 consecutive terms, which he maxed out in 2008. But if you remember, then they had this weird, this interregnum by Medvedev, who used to be the prime minister up to that point, and then became president for 4 years, and then Putin came back. So doing it this way meant he never officially violated the constitution. So he played it by the books, but still managed to, extend his powers into the future. Elections have become extremely hard to assess from the outside, primarily because foreign NGOs can no longer monitor Russian elections. So, for example, intergovernmental organizations like the OSCE can still get in because Russia is a member of the OSCE. But there are a gazillion ways you can limit these observers' ability to really understand what's going on the grounds. So the same is true for opposition parties, political parties. The Central Electoral Commission is pretty much in Putin's hands. So they can reject parties, they can reject candidates. That means you can only really run if you have been kind of pre-approved by Putin and his political machinery. So this leaves very little breathing room for real political opposition in Russia. And should you happen to become an opposition politician with a little more, a larger following and more media attention, then you really run the risk of being thrown into prison under very dubious, circumstances, or worst thing, you get killed, and that can happen at home and abroad. And we have had cases for that too, countless cases in the last 20 years. Now, from a cultural point of view, Putin made a quite interesting, smart move. He sort of developed or rekindled the relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. So, and that's despite the fact that he himself is not a religious person at all. But sort of it feeds into this narrative of a strong Russia that represents, traditional values, family, traditions, rejecting a lot of the things, a lot of the values that the West now has embraced, cultural diversity, LGBTQ rights, gender equality, etc., etc. These are all things that Putin and sort of the Putin machinery depict as weak Western, kind of snowflakey, if I want to use that term, snowflakey identity, right? And Russia is the opposite of that. It's tough. It's, following these traditional values. Now, lastly, domestically, he has also re-centralized Russia, right? So the regions that previously under Yeltsin were gaining more independence and autonomy, all of this has been undone, and governors used to be elected by the regional population, by the regional citizens. Now they are again appointed by Vladimir Putin. So a dramatic tightening of the grip on the regions. Okay. Now, switching back to the global sphere here, one really has to keep in mind that despite all the media presence of Russia, right, and all this interference, when you look at the naked numbers, Russia is still vastly outspent by the West, right? The US, NATO, as well as China spend way more money on the military than Russia. So that has forced Russia to do several things simultaneously, not only modernize, but also resize the army, right? So it's much smaller now than it used to be. They have slowly started to modernize the army. Russia is again experimenting with nuclear arms innovations. It has left most of the arms control agreements they signed with the US over the last 30 years. Russia is in constant violation of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty. There was a treaty signed in the late 80s that would limit, so to speak, the disposition of conventional forces. This is especially true since the annexation of Crimea. So all of these agreements are basically at this point null and void. Another result of this relative weakness in conventional forces is that Russia has really sort of bought into this concept of hybrid warfare. So hybrid warfare is a mix of classic propaganda and misinformation that increasingly plays out on the internet, as well as on various social media platforms. So that's sort of a repackaged, retooled a propaganda machinery that makes use of digital information and communication networks. It mixes this reliance on propaganda with classic armed aggression. So this could be indirect support of Russian volunteers who, for example, move into the Ukraine to help their brethren, fight against Ukrainian suppression of the Russian minority. But this can also be, a collaboration with cyber criminal organizations in Russia. So think about, so to speak, my classic example that I often use in class with students is a bored teenager in Siberia who has a good computer and a strong internet connection and starts hacking into, Western institutions. As long as this serves Putin's interests, that is fine, and he can always deny any involvement, right? Because these are just individuals who are criminals. But in the reality is that, he is probably coordinating this and definitely profiting from all of this. So there's a loose collaboration, and only if those people go too far, causing some potential real problems in the diplomatic realm, will he, go in and stop these activities. So this hybrid warfare has been practiced. The first time we witnessed this was in Georgia in 2008. Georgia at that point was a strong contender for NATO membership. The George W. Bush administration supported this pretty much. And for Putin, this was, of course, a red line, right? Because this was a former Soviet republic that was sitting in a geostrategically important region in the Caucasus. And so under the pretense of protecting the Russian minorities in two secessionist regions in Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, he basically sent in Russian peacekeepers. At the same time, they basically turned off the internet in Georgia, right? So this was a test run. Eventually, he retreated, but this had such a chilling effect that Georgia since then has never, further pursued this option of NATO membership. And then, of course, we saw a repeat of that in a more sophisticated way in 2014 when he annexed Crimea. The main reason for that was that he had to make sure that, the Ukraine, who at that point was really strongly pivoting towards the West, wasn't gonna join NATO because the Russians had and still have a huge naval base in Sevastopol on the Black Sea. So he basically sacked Crimea to make sure that the Ukraine would not, further pursue potential NATO membership. Most of you might know this. NATO has three basic conditions for membership. You have to be a functioning democracy. You have to pursue, sort of a liberal market economy, and you cannot have any open or unresolved border disputes with neighboring countries. So by basically annexing Crimea and then also supporting the secessionists in the east of the Ukraine, he technically made it very, very unlikely that the Ukraine will ever join NATO or the European Union for that matter. We also saw this propaganda and misinformation strategy being widely applied and implemented during the most recent elections, two cycles, right? 2016, the presidential elections, and then the most recent ones. Although at that point, the US was aware of this potential danger. And then there's also a lot of evidence that the Russians tried to, manipulate the public perceptions, revolving around the question of Brexit in 2016. So this is all used to, basically drive wedges into this Western alliance. And then two other examples of Russia's interference. Now, in these two cases, it's more classic, right? in the sense of military interference. In Syria, obviously, since 2011, the Russians are present physically. And then also recently, I've gotten more involved in Libya, primarily via a now well-known private security contractor, the Russian security contractor, the so-called Wagner Group, which is operating with several thousand employees, or shall we call them mercenaries, in Libya, actually. So why is Russia doing all of this? Well, first of all, it would like to regain its great power status that Putin is convinced it deserves, tracing it all the way back to the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So he still simply wants to reestablish Russia as a big player on the world stage that can't be ignored. He also wants to provide, so to speak, an alternative vision for this Western-led international system, right? So, you know, historically, we've been promoting democracy, human rights, you know, liberal market economy and all of these things. And we thought we had sort of won the Cold War, and this was sort of the last available option for a lot of people around the planet. And he just believes that there is another alternative, right? That there's a Russian way. Just like the Chinese think that there is now a Chinese-led alternative vision for the world that doesn't necessarily involve democracy, right, or a strong emphasis on human rights. He also thinks that the system has to be moved away from this sort of unipolar system where the US plays this hegemonic role, right, of really dominating the system. And he's in cahoots in that regard, or on the same side as China, right? I mean, both of them would like to establish what we call a multipolar system, right, where you have multiple powers that are able to shape world politics according to their interests. He certainly wants to maintain a sphere of influence in what the Russians call the near abroad. So it used to be called the cordon sanitaire. Now it's called the near abroad. What it is basically a sort of a ring of countries around Russia that should maintain or should be kept in this limbo, right? They cannot join, for various reasons, Western institutions. But he also doesn't want to directly reabsorb them, because that would be, you know, massive, you know, undertaking. But it's fine for him to keep them in limbo, right? To lean into them, to exert pressure, to make it impossible for them to, you know, make truly independent and sovereign decisions regarding these, you know, various membership opportunities. At the same time, he tries to portray Russia as a reasonable player, you know, who can offer constructive solutions for many problems. I call it here a nimble foreign policy machinery. You know, we're just trying to find solutions and please engage us in diplomacy. While at the same time, he relies on this extensive network of non-state actors, right? These criminal organizations, et cetera, auxiliary players that he claims are beyond Russian control. But that in reality, he at least has a coordinating role in all of this. And then ultimately, on the domestic level, he tries, of course, to insulate Russian society from foreign cultural influences, right? Anything that could threaten or soften this sort of Russian cultural identity. He definitely, and this has intensified in the wake of, you know, all these failed uprisings in the Middle East and in Northern Africa. So the Arab Spring was something that, you know, was in many ways very concerning to Putin and his political entourage, because there's always this fear that eventually, you know, there might be something like a Russian Spring where the citizens finally, you know, revolt as unlikely as this might be, because he has really relatively stable approval ratings that most Western politicians can only dream of. You know, somewhere between 60 and 80% show of the Russian citizenry show support for what Putin does. He also has to slowly start thinking about how he will preserve, so to speak, his legacy. So there's a big question mark behind that. You know, who's going to succeed him? Who is going to maintain this system? And ultimately, scholars have also made the argument that a lot of this sort of interfering in various places abroad is, of course, a way for him to detract from serious domestic problems and failures. You know, I mean, the living standards haven't really improved dramatically. You know, the healthcare services are really bad. There are huge discrepancies and inequalities between, you know, the St. Petersburg and Moscow, and, so to speak, the rest of the country. I mean, this is night and day. And so, you know, as often is the case, if you don't want to or can't really solve domestic problems, what do? You create a huge diversion, and that the prime candidate for that is you know, problems abroad that are then used to also shore up you know, domestic support and patriotism. So those are, in a nutshell, so to speak, the goals that he has. And I think I have come with that. I've come to an end, actually. And here on the map here, you just see this sort of, you know, this sort of encirclement. You know, I mean, Russia really has this. I actually have to go back. I think there was a map for, earlier where, yeah, here we have this. So here you really see sort of the lines of the former Soviet Union, right? Here in red. And that's basically what they still consider the near abroad, their sphere of interest. Some of those countries, of course, are now squarely in the Western camp, such as the Baltic states, who I'm sure are pretty happy at this point that they have NATO and the European Union. You know, and so I would say those are insulated, and those would be prime candidates for this kind of interference, because Estonia and Latvia have rather sizable Russian minorities that could serve as an excuse to start interfering, right? But from all the surveys I have seen, even among the ethnic Russians in those countries, there's an overwhelming support for, you know, being in that Western camp, right? But with all these other countries, they are not in that. They don't have that luxury at this point. Right? They're really sort of caught in the middle here. Yeah, so that's where I am. Thank you so much. And I think we can open up for the plenum for questions.
So there is one question in the chat feature currently from
Let me look at that.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, the International Space Station. Yeah, this is one of these sort of awkward things, you know, it's sort of this outlier that, you know, while we see all this, you know, competition and all this back and forth spheres of influence, you do have these sort of occasional points of collaboration, which of course this is also in terms of PR and image, right? I mean, it serves as a sort of as a counterpoint to that ruthlessness, you know, that no, look at that, we're collaborating with the West, you know, we're not sort of these diehard you know, underminers of world peace. So, you know, this is I mean, at least it's the way I see it, right? It's an interesting outlier there that's, you know, presents the other side of Russia, right? Maybe also the peace, the uniting, you know, of people through science, you know, to work towards, you know, in this case, space exploration, right? Yeah, so that's an interesting one. It's also de facto, you know, I mean, Russia has one of the few programs that can actually launch things into space rather cheaply. So despite all these animosities and problems, also the European Space Agency uses occasionally, Russian rockets to get stuff up there. So, and of course, it serves as a sign of Russian technological sophistication. This is so yeah. I hope that answered, or at least that's how I see it. What happens when with Russia when Putin dies? This is a very good question. I mean, he's still got a way to go, I assume. Off the top of my head, I don't know exactly how old he is, but I think he's maybe in his 60s, mid-60s now. So, and he keeps very fit. As I had these images, he likes to display his, he's like a macho guy. You've seen these images of him, bare-chested, fly fishing, riding on horses, doing, I think, judo. So he's, maybe compared to some other high-ranking politicians in the West, he's rather fit. So I think he has ways to go. But again, this is the big problem, right? I mean, this is always the problem for autocrats, especially if you spend decades making sure that there's no internal opponent, right? Well, once you get to that moment where you want to step down, your biggest problem is how do I organize my succession? So do you cherry pick somebody? But that requires basically investing in a particular person, long before they get to that moment. So that's always a tricky question for autocrats. Then there's a question about China. Let me quickly read that. Well, it's again, historically, this is a quite complex relationship, Russia-China. I mean, obviously, for a long time, there was simply, two big dogs in the communist camp. And China drove an independent course, right? It wasn't part of, it wasn't close to the Soviet Union beyond sort of, the ideological basis. But China, for a long time, tried to do its own thing. And, there are, of course, close economic ties. China needs energy, and Putin has used this repeatedly in the past, to sort of, veil threats, towards the West, towards Europe. If you don't want my gas, I can as well just turn around and sell it to the Chinese, who will take it gladly. The Chinese also bought a lot of weapons, armaments in the 90s. I mean, they were, so they sort of helped keep Russia afloat to some extent. I mean, nowadays, obviously, China can do this all by itself. But when you look at their, their armaments, I mean, a lot of this are licensed. If you look at interceptor planes, for example, the Air Force in China is until very recently was mostly made up of planes that the models were licensed Russian models, right? All the MiG models. And only recently have they started to really develop their own stealth, for example, stealth planes and stuff like that. So I think there is a lot of common interest, simply in the sense that they want to balance, of course, the United States. Right, so to some extent, Putin is also latching on, but there's always this sort of uneasiness, right? In that. So the old, saying "my enemy's enemy is my friend" applies to those two, right? I mean, they roughly have the same competitor in mind, which is the US, or to some extent the West. And there's potential for future collaboration. If you think about the Belt Initiative of China, sort of revitalizing the Silk Road across Central Asia all the way to Europe. So there are potential benefits for both, but the way I see it, it's not sort of this unconditional love relationship. It's not a bromance in the classic sense. It is a more utilitarian collaboration, I would say. And of course, not to forget that China is the much bigger partner at this point in that relationship, right? I mean, China is a behemoth compared to Russia, not just in terms of population, but I just had to look this up the other day because most people don't think about it that way. The Russian GDP that I showed you initially is just a little bit larger than Spain's GDP. You have to put that in perspective. I think it's only about $200 billion larger than Spain's GDP. So, you have basically a Spain, economically speaking, with nuclear arms that we're talking about. So sometimes people get this impression that Russia is sort of this really, really powerful country, that has lots and tons of resources and to play with. And the reality is, no, the resources are actually quite limited, So maybe in many ways, Russia is punching way above its weight category, right? So again, this is of course the intended effect, right? They want us to take them serious, right? So what else? Let's see. Yes, Russia definitely was thrilled to see the US march into Afghanistan and commit all the same mistakes. I mean, and we could have gone even further back and looked at what happened to the British in Afghanistan, right? I mean, this is sort of a huge grave for foreign powers to go into. We thought we could do it. The Russians knew probably from the get-go this was going to be long and, quite wasteful in many ways. Yeah, so I mean, we've hopefully learned that lesson, right? Will the Russians invade the Ukraine? Well, that's the big question, right? That's what we're all waiting for. I've talked to some other colleagues, I have a colleague who, Dr. Neil Jesse in the political science department, just published a book actually on Russian warfare. I've talked with him and both of us, we don't really see it. We don't believe that he's really gonna go and invade Russia. What he might do is try to tighten his grip on those three secessionist regions in the east that, let me see if I can get back to that map. So here you see basically the east of the Ukraine. I mean, that historically, the Ukraine is a very interesting case of a post-communist country because culturally, it's always, and economically, it's always been split, right? The western part has Ukrainian as a language, which is different from Russian. It has historically been a more agricultural dominated part of the Ukraine. The east is the Russian-speaking part and is the heavily industrialized part. So this has been a problem since Ukraine's independence in 1991. And what we think is the most likely scenario is that he will keep this region in limbo, right, in permanent limbo, just to exert pressure on the Ukraine. Because you have to imagine, I mean, if he really invades the Ukraine, it's gonna cost a lot in terms of human resources, in terms of economic resources that have to be dedicated to this. Let's not forget that right now, GDP hasn't kept growing in Russia. For the last 2 years, actually, we've seen a dip. And all of this has to do with, world market prices, sanctions. So, I mean, the question always is, what do you gain from directly going in and occupying? That's very costly. There will be a huge backlash. And we just think he's better off, and it's cheaper for him by keeping this situation murky. and that you can do rather cheaply, and you still get the West to they have to engage with you in one way or another. So yeah, so let's see what happens. I'm always very I try not to make too strong a prediction, but a direct occupation or direct invasion, at least not of the whole Ukraine, right? Because then he really is bordering NATO territory, right? Directly. So, and I think that would be an absolute red line also for the West. Do you think Trump was trying to be like Putin? Well, luckily he wasn't. I mean, this is a little bit the realm of, depends on your perspective on it. I would say there was maybe some adoration on the side of the previous president. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on presidents and the presidency itself, but as it presented itself to me, I think there was a lot of affinity, right? I mean, maybe in his wildest dreams, if he could have it his way, but luckily we still live in a democracy here where there's lots of checks and balances. As stuck or as broken down as the system appears sometimes, but there's something to be said about the sort of the dispersion of political power throughout the system. You got the courts, you got the states. So it's not as easy or it wouldn't be easy in the United States to achieve that. But I do think there was some adoration for strongmen. I mean, we've seen this in his relationship with Putin, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, right? I mean, he made a lot of positive comments about these politicians that clearly show authoritarian tendencies. So yeah, I don't think it was a fabrication. There's just too much evidence out there from many different sources that I have some colleagues in the field who were always convinced that the Russians had some sort of what they call compromat on Trump. Compromat is simply embarrassing evidence of certain things that they don't publish, but they keep it in the back to, just in case, as leverage. I don't know about this, but I do buy into the argument of adoration. Yes. Let's see what else. Would Russia still threaten the Ukraine if Trump was still in power? Well, that's a good question. I don't know if President Trump, I don't know. I'm not sure. I mean, there's a president, and then there's sort of the larger geostrategic interests of the United States. I hope he wouldn't have caved in, and sort of sold out the Ukraine. But that is now pure speculation, what Trump would have done. Maybe he would have tried to strike some sort of deal with Putin, basically, making sure, maybe committing to the Ukraine not becoming a NATO member, right? Because that's what Putin really wants, right? He wants basically that it becomes impossible for the Ukraine to join NATO in the future. And the current Biden administration says this is sort of we will not commit to anything like that, because if we cave in the Ukraine, who's going to say that he doesn't try this in the future with other countries that have these types of aspirations? So, yeah, it's hard to, I wouldn't want to speculate on that, what would have President Trump done in that situation? There's definitely a problem regarding the demographics. I just looked it up. I didn't put it into the presentation, but I looked it up yesterday. Obviously, there is a decrease in population, right? The projections for the future, we'll see. Right now, it's about 140 million. I think the projection said by 2030, it's about 140 million people. That's definitely going to decline. And it's a sad fact that life expectancy in Russia post 1990 has not improved. Right? It's actually, when you look at the life expectancy, particularly of men, it has really sort of gone off a cliff. And we are only now approaching sort of what was the average life expectancy during communist times. So, yeah, I mean, that's just an indicator of how, you know, bad the situation is in socioeconomic terms, and particularly healthcare is a big problem. Would the Ukraine, I see there's an interesting question. The Ukraine could call Putin's bluff by giving Russia the separatist East part of the Ukraine in exchange for being allowed to join NATO. Well, I don't know if the Ukrainian leadership at this point is ready to, you know, make that kind of deal. I don't think that would be, it would of course be a huge gamble and to see what Putin would do in that case, but because his prime objective really is to prevent the Ukraine from joining, you know, he would get himself more territory, which then he has to, you know, invest heavily into. That's what happened with Crimea, right? I mean, they had to build new electricity lines, and, you know, it has not been a great deal so far, you know, economically speaking. Crimea is a money pit. So, you know, to buy yourself another money pit, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense for him, when the primary target goal is to just maintain leverage in the near abroad. So that's at least, you know, how I see it. Yeah, I think I'm just going through the chat, but I think those were, there's one more popping up. Let's see. Yes, Germany is in this regard absolutely a non-issue. You know, Germany has really sort of this is post 1945, right? I mean, the Germans really had to reimagine themselves as something else, and it's one of these examples, rare examples. The other one would be Japan, right? I mean, actually both countries serve as an example how national identities can change as a consequence of traumatic loss, right? Defeat, the realization that whatever you stood for and whatever you tried to achieve simply was a dead end. And so, you know, to this day, Germany doesn't think of itself as a military power. The Germans are very uncomfortable with using military power to, you know, achieve political goals. Their participation in Afghanistan was a huge problem for the ruling coalition. They spent a lot of energy to justify their participation. So there's a general unease with that, to the point where now actually the German army is really not in very good condition. I mean, they really have to invest massively to modernize the German army. Yeah, so, you know, Germany is certainly not the threat at this point. You don't have to, the Russians certainly don't have to fear Germany, militarily speaking. There are actually demands towards Germany now. I mean, and, you know, there's something to be said to that. So I do actually agree with former President Trump on that one, right? That the Europeans have to invest more heavily in their own military defense. I agree with him that there was a lot of free riding going on in Europe. That is, of course, was a long established pattern, you know, I mean, that started right after World War II. And I think for the Europeans, with the exception of the French, this has become a very cushy proposition, you know, that you have sort of, you have a sugar daddy on the other side of the Atlantic who will take care of you if things go bad. And it takes time to change perceptions. You have to just take the money and be willing to do this. So take over more responsibility yourself. I've always agreed with that proposition. But again, this discussion has been going on for this. You can trace this back to the 70s, right? The burden sharing debate in NATO, that's nothing new. That has always been around. It's just President Trump, put it back more prominently, put it back on the table. And yeah, I agree. The Europeans as such have to do more in that regard. But it runs a little bit counter to how the European Union likes to think of itself, right? I mean, the Europeans always portray themselves more as an economic power. And, they have sort of downplayed consistently the military side of things. And that was partly also because they had NATO. Right? You cannot forget that pretty much with the exception of Norway and Turkey, every NATO member in Europe is also a EU member. Right? But not every EU member is a NATO member. I mean, my own native Austria, is technically still a neutral country, although that's impossible being an EU country, right? Anyway, we like to think of ourselves as a neutral country. So actually that explains the question, right? I mean, it's the last question here by Mr. Nielsen. There are simply countries in the European Union that, during the Cold War had to remain neutral. It wasn't like the Austrians wouldn't have liked to join the European community, as it was then called, before 1990, but that was not possible because the Russians had a say in any decision that would impact our neutral status. So the Austrians, for example, could only, this was 1990, basically traveled to Moscow and more or less begged Gorbachev at the time, to allow them to start negotiations over EU membership. Well, Gorbachev at that point had, of course, signaled to the West that the Soviets were no longer going to interfere in these matters. So at that point, only at that point, was Austria able to, start negotiations. And that was true for other countries too. I mean, think about Finland, Sweden. And we have maintained a little bit this identity, right? I mean, we still have it actually in the Constitution, but it's pretty meaningless because EU law trumps national law in many cases. So I always call this, this is a typical topic that politicians unpack during some national holiday, and it's still very much present in people's minds. But in today's world, it's actually pretty meaningless. Right? This was a particular tool to, gain independence first after World War II, and then sort of maintain a sort of relatively safe position between the two blocs during the Cold War. Right? So yeah, I hope that explains it a little bit at least. I would be happy to talk way more about that, but that's not the main topic today. The Arctic, definitely, this is going to be the next big thing. There's the Arctic, as the ice shelf recedes, and there are all these assumptions about raw materials that we could possibly extract there. Yeah, this is going to be a future geopolitical, battle space, so to speak. Right? There's a lot of competition already. And again, Russia is sort of setting the pace a little bit. If I remember a couple of years ago, they're always good for these stunts, right? Claiming territory, posting the Russia flag somewhere on the, in the sea somewhere, on the sea bottom, claiming territory. So I agree. This is not a lot. This is not a lot of people talk about it. The media doesn't pay that much attention to it. But in academia, this is a topic. Right? This is sort of similar to space. This is a thing that's going to start playing a bigger role in the years to come. Don't see any for the moment.
If there are any other questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you'd prefer to do that instead of putting them in the chat feature.
Again, we will see what happens, but I don't see a full-scale invasion. That is too risky, and the question always is, what are you going to get out of it at the end? It could really backfire in many ways. So there's a lot of posturing going on. I mean, Putin just ultimately wants some concessions from the West, and it all pertains to the near abroad. And the Ukraine, is one of the few that's up for, that's up for grabs, so to speak. Belarus is squarely in the Russian camp. Some of the Caucasus countries are close out of necessity with Russia. Kazakhstan, I don't know if you've seen this recently in the last 2 weeks, there were these street protests and uprisings against the government. And the Kazakh government asked the Commonwealth of Independent States, which has a sort of peacekeeping troops, again under quotation marks, to assist them in maintaining, reestablishing public order. So Russia was more than happy. I think it was Russia, Belarus, and Armenia that sent in troops to sort of calm the situation down. So that's just, another sign of force and saying, listen, if we have to, we can go to other countries and maybe help prop up the governments, their pro-Russian governments. But officially, they were termed peacekeepers, right? They were not there to crush the opposition. They were there to maintain public safety. The message was clear, though. Don't have any aspirations towards, democratizing or that type of stuff.
When the USSR was broken up, how did they decide which countries are going to be the boundaries and all?
Well, technically in their minds, particularly the countries that used to be an integral part of the Soviet Union, right? So let's go back to that. See if I can go back to that map. So here, you basically, anything that falls within that red line in the lower map is sort of what the Russians would consider a sphere of, that's the sphere they're interested in, geographically speaking. Again, the three countries they have lost pretty much for good are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Those three managed to get out in time. But everybody else is, part of that sphere of influence. It's almost like, it's like the equivalent of a Monroe Doctrine that the US has had with regards to Latin America. That's similar here with Russia, I would say. Because beyond that, I mean, yeah, you're running quickly into other players that are, considerably more worthy opponents than, or, competitors than the Ukraine. I mean, Iran in the south. There is, of course, collaboration going on between the two. Kazakhstan and a lot of the Central Asian governments obviously are still close with Russia because there's always the possibility of propping up those governments. Yeah, I would say that's pretty much the limitation. Those are also the limitations, because if you look westward, I mean, past Belarus, I mean, you're talking EU and NATO, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary. I mean, Hungary is sort of an interesting case these days, right? Particularly when it comes to democracy and human rights. So actually, I retract my former statements. There are some, Poland and Hungary right now are problematic cases also within these two organizations. Right? Poland more, go ahead, sorry.
No, that's all right. You go ahead.
Well, I was saying Poland more so domestically, right? But obviously they are very concerned about Russia from a NATO point of view, right? I mean, I'm sure they're happy that they are in NATO nowadays too, right? So
I was just checking in to see if anyone else has any other questions. We do have a couple more minutes here in case you had any more questions.
oh, what country am I originally from? Well, I am originally from Austria, from Vienna. But I've been here at Bowling Green for 15 years now. I'm approaching that moment in my life where Ohio is the place where I've lived the longest, actually. It's always a turning point for transplants, you know. But it's been great so far. I'm very happy to be at BGSU.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Dr. Fritsch, for leading this discussion for us today. We appreciate you being here. We do plan to be back in person with the virtual option next Saturday, February 12th. We will be discussing outer space with Dr. Yagnik from Penn State. So we will see you all next Saturday. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. It was, as always, a pleasure. And stay safe, warm, and yeah, enjoy the next presentations. This is a great program, and it's always great to be back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.